The Treaty of Rome created what we know as the European Union 60 years ago this week. Is an integrated Europe still possible in the future? Plus, newer, smaller, advanced technology to help people with hearing problems. I'm Shuli Ghosh. This is Insight. Hello, welcome to the programme. 60 years ago on Saturday, 6 European governments signed the Treaty of Rome, which created the European Economic Community, or EEC. It was the forerunner of today's European Union. As the UK prepares to leave the EU and we see growing Euroscepticism, what does the future hold for an integrated Europe? Insight's Tig Enright explains.
60 years ago, Europe was in a very different place. When its leaders signed the Treaty of Rome, the foundation of today's European Union, the divisions caused by war, were recent memories. 6 founding members, led by France and Germany, saw a brighter future bound together by trade. Since then, it's grown and evolved, deepening the ties between its constituents.
Membership of the European Common Market is another big issue.
Taking in new members and creating a shared currency. Not without its challenges, it used to seem as if the EU could weather any storm, until last year, one of its biggest members elected to leave.
And it's changed forever.
The EU felt like an unstoppable juggernaut, but Brexit has put on the brakes, making this anniversary more significant, demanding pause for thought.
We must have the courage to accept that certain countries move forward and can advance more quickly than others.
Unity doesn't mean uniformity. That's why I'm calling for new forms of cooperation, for new projects that we will call multi-speed cooperation.
Spain is ready to go further with integration with all those who wish to pursue that integration.
Europe's problem for a long time has been differing levels of enthusiasm for more integration. That certainly was the case here. Some believe the only solution is a two-speed Europe, in which some countries move faster together regardless of others' reluctance. Now that Britain has turned the other way, the European Commission has written a pretty simple list of options. Choosing between them will be a lot more complicated. Option 1 is to simply carry on as a 27-member bloc. Option 2 would be to do nothing but the single market in future. Option 3 is being backed by most leaders as most realistic. Those who want more, do more. But other options include doing less, more efficiently, focusing European policy on a smaller range of areas. And then there's the federalist stream, doing much more together.
Although it has become fashionable, I don't proceed by issuing executive orders. It will be up to the European Parliament, to national parliaments, governments and civil society, in other words to the citizens, to have their say.
Citizens in some member states have a say on their own futures this year, at a time when Euroscepticism is at its highest in living memory. If Marine Le Pen's National Front wins the French presidential election, she's promised a referendum on EU membership. Although the anti-European Freedom Party failed in its bid to become the biggest in last week's Dutch election, it did make gains. And Italy's Five Star Movement, which wants to take the country out of the euro currency, is leading the polls ahead of an election there, expected sometime in the next year. The 60th anniversary event will be held where it all began, in Rome. Europe loves political leaks, and true to form, a draft of the declaration that will be made emerged weeks in advance. It will say, unity is a necessity, not an option, and those that leave risk being sidelined by global dynamics. A message that sounds a lot more fearful than the hope that gave birth to the Union. Tig Enright reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss things further, I'm joined in the studio by political writer and commentator Michael Goldfarb. Michael, welcome to the programme. We know that EU leaders are going to be gathering to celebrate, as it were, the 60-year anniversary of the Roma Treaty, but you wonder, given the state of Europe today, what exactly it is that they're celebrating.
Well, I think they're celebrating, I hope they're celebrating the political achievement of Europe being at peace and comparative prosperity for the longest period in a couple of centuries, actually, through the modern, in the long-term sense, the modern era.
And it's easy to overlook those achievements, but when you look at the core values that we've achieved, democracy, stability, peace, I mean, they are at the heart of what the European experiment was set up to achieve.
Exactly. And, you know, what's interesting is, yes, I mean, the problems are tremendous, and make no mistake, but people have to consider when in modern times, any set of nations, but particularly those, you know, so close in geography, you had the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, and all of these countries that had been under Soviet subjugation suddenly had regained their autonomy. And they've been folded in, despite the fact that, you know, for decades they didn't develop at the same pace as Western Europe. They've been folded in. And yeah, there are plenty of problems, but let's think about the foundation. And the foundation is a very strong one. And I think that that's what they will be reminding each other. And then we get into other things about whether the euro can continue in its present form, whether a two-speed Europe, as we heard in the report, is actually a necessary development. Because, you know, you can't have a club with 28 nations, well, 27 soon, once Britain leaves. You can't have a club of 27 nations where only some are participating in the currency union.
So I mean, this is the idea of this multi-speed.
Well, I mean, in fact, there's a de facto
different standards of integration.
But it is de facto two-speed, and it has been since the Maastricht Treaty, which is almost 25 years ago, when the further integration economically through the single currency was first proposed, and Britain, as one of the big three in the EU, said, we're not doing it. When border-free travel was, the Schengen Agreement was first proposed. This is all in the Maastricht Treaty. And, you know, Britain said, no, we're not going to do it. That immediately created a two-speed Europe because Britain is, as I say, one of the big three economies.
But if you take that analogy even further, if we could have had a model where Britain could have been even more towards the outside wheel of the integration, would that have satisfied the more Eurosceptic members of Parliament? David Cameron, would that have been
Yes, it should have. Well, it should have. But, you know, I think one of the things people lose sight of in Brexit is that Brexit is very much, it's been a long-term argument within the Conservative Party, which went national. And it picked up steam and ultimately led to success in the vote because of global problems in the economic system of, you know, the globalized capitalist system so heavily based on financial services. When we had the crash in 2008, people all over well, we call it the first world, I don't think it's a politically correct term anymore, suffered and continue to suffer. And when you have economic hard times, people look and it's easy to blame something foreign, and the EU seems to be something foreign. And so that's how that argument, which was going on inside the Conservative Party, suddenly reached out through UKIP into former Labour heartlands. We had the vote here in the UK, and people voted for Brexit.
And we're also seeing, of course, the rise of nationalist parties, Eurosceptic parties across Europe.
And of course, nationalism is, you know, a response also to the crash of 2008. You know, in the initial phases, the speed with which countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, well, when the Iron Curtain fell, it was still Czechoslovakia. Czech Republic, Hungary, they clamored to get into the EU because they wanted the protection, because their history with Russia has always been a very difficult one. It wasn't just the Soviet Union that has impacted on their national histories. Russia has always tried to expand westward, and they couldn't wait to get in. But then 2008 happened. They were in the EU by that time, and many of them, you know, didn't get all the benefits ordinary people to get all the benefits of
ordinary
joining.
people feel that the economic crisis impacted badly on
Exactly.
them. The migration, refugee crisis is also a big issue. But one of the other criticisms is that there's too much bureaucracy. There are too many EU directives.
And this is absolutely
These
true.
institutions are out of date.
Well, you know, look, nature abhors a vacuum, and, you know, it's the same when you organize an administration. If you don't claim power for one group or another, the bureaucrats always claim the power. And this is what happened with the European Commission, and people watching may not understand. There's this thing called the EC, that's the European Commission. It's the administrative wing of the European Union, which has its own parliament and so on. And you know, the bureaucrats have seized power. That's what bureaucrats do. They haven't done it with an army. They haven't done it by taking away, you know, civil rights or human rights. They did it because there was a power vacuum.
Okay, so we've got an election coming up in France. We've got elections in Germany. We've got the UK on the brink of leaving the EU. Where do you see the integration of Europe going forward?
I think there will be a pause. I think there has to be a pause, and I think there needs to be a reconfiguration of the economy within Europe, and particularly within the Eurozone. I think that the problem of the imbalance between the extraordinarily strong German economy and the very weak southern tier economies needs to be addressed. But I have to say, I think other than in the UK, not even in France, where Marine Le Pen is running very well on a pledge to, at the very least, leave the euro and quite possibly leave the European Union. There is no political will, and also at grassroots, there is no political desire to break up the EU. It still, as a political experiment, has a long, long way to run.
Michael, good to talk with you. Thank you very much indeed for that. Michael Goldfarb there. You're watching Insight. Coming up, developments in hearing technology. Stay with us.